AITAH. For calling out my husband for changing up the rules in our open marriage? I never imagined my life would turn out like this. I'm 35, married with kids, living a comfortable life in a quiet suburb somewhere in America. On the surface, everything looks normal. My neighbors smile at me when I wave. My kids laugh and play in the yard. And I carry on like any other mom in this cookie-cutter neighborhood. But underneath, there's something different about my life. A secret that only my husband and I know about. I'm in an open marriage. It wasn't always this way. In fact, if you had asked me 5 years ago if I ever thought I'd be in an open relationship, I would have laughed in your face. I was the woman who believed in traditional marriage, who thought love was about commitment, loyalty, and monogamy. But now I'm navigating a reality that feels miles away from the life I envisioned for myself. It all started over the summer. My husband, Kevin, brought up the idea casually one night, as if he were suggesting we try a new restaurant for dinner. I remember the moment so clearly. We were sitting on the back porch. The kids were in bed, and the air was warm with the scent of fresh cut grass. Kevin had this way of bringing up things that made them seem less daunting, less intense than they actually were. He told me he'd been thinking about how we'd gotten a bit stagnant. How maybe some new experiences could spice things up. At first, I was caught off guard. Who wouldn't be? The man I'd been with for over a decade was suddenly suggesting that we start seeing other people. My initial reaction was a hard no. But Kevin, ever persuasive, explained how it could work. How it didn't have to change anything between us. Just add a layer of excitement we'd been missing. He framed it like it was a choice we'd make together. That we'd still be a team. That this was just another chapter in our relationship. I wasn't totally on board. The idea of sharing him with someone else felt wrong. But over the next few weeks, he kept bringing it up. And slowly, my resistance wore down. He wasn't pushy exactly, but he was persistent. He had a way of framing it that made me feel guilty for not being open to something new. For not trusting him enough to give it a try. And maybe, deep down, I was afraid of losing him if I didn't at least consider it. So, eventually, I agreed. The first few weeks were strange. I wasn't exactly comfortable with it. But I told myself it was just an adjustment period. I mean, what else was I supposed to do? Kevin had been good to me over the years. And I didn't want to be the one standing in the way of what he wanted. It took some getting used to. The idea of him being with someone else. But he made sure to reassure me that it wouldn't change anything between us. We were still partners, still in this together. We agreed on a don't ask, don't tell policy, something that would allow us both to keep our privacy and avoid awkward conversations. He wouldn't ask about who I was seeing, and I wouldn't pry into his dating life. It felt like a safe way to protect the foundation of our marriage. But deep down, a part of me was anxious. I told myself it was just nerves. That I'd eventually get used to it. And I did. Or at least, I thought I did. In the beginning, things were fine. We were both figuring it out. Navigating the awkwardness of dating while still being married. I met a few people. Nothing serious at first. Just casual dates to test the waters. And then, after a few months, I met Evan. Evan is different. He's older, 45. And carries himself with this calm, steady confidence that's hard to resist. There's something about him that made me feel alive again. Like I was being seen and appreciated in ways I hadn't felt in years. The excitement I felt when I was with him was like nothing I'd experienced in a long time. It was fun. It was freeing. But that's when things with Kevin started to change. When I first mentioned Evan to Kevin, I kept it light. I didn't go into details because of our agreement. But I told him I'd been seeing someone new. At first, he seemed fine with it. He'd always been the one to push for this lifestyle. After all, but the more I talked about Evan, the little things, like how he made me feel good or how we'd gone on some fun dates, the more Kevin's attitude shifted. Suddenly, he was asking questions that felt intrusive, given the agreement we had. He wanted to know more about Evan, how serious it was, what we did together. How I felt about him. At first, I gave him small, vague answers, hoping that would satisfy him. But it never did. He kept pushing, kept digging for more details. And the more I shared, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was as if the rules he'd set up at the beginning were starting to change. But only when it came to me. Then came the critiques. Everything I said about Evan, Kevin would downplay or find a way to diminish. If I mentioned something nice Evan had done, Kevin would brush it off, saying, "Well, that's just what guys do when they're trying to impress someone." Or if I talked about how fun our dates were, he'd comment, "Yeah, but that's all surface level stuff. It's not real." I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin wasn't handling this as well as he claimed. The man who had once been so eager for this open marriage now seemed to be struggling with the reality of it. Especially when it came to me finding someone who made me happy. It wasn't just the comments, though. His actions started changing too. Like last week, when I had a date planned with Evan, I had asked Kevin to watch the kids. And he agreed, saying he'd be home by 9. But then, right before I was supposed to leave, he texted me, saying he was working overtime and wouldn't make it back in time. I was left scrambling for a sitter. And it wasn't the first time he'd pulled something like this. It felt like sabotage, like he didn't want me to enjoy myself. I ended up finding a sitter at the last minute. But the whole situation left me frustrated and anxious. I couldn't relax on the date because I had to cut it short to get back home. And when I confronted Kevin about it later, he acted as if nothing was wrong. As if it was just an unfortunate coincidence. It's like he's slowly trying to reel me back in. To control the situation in subtle ways. And while I try to adapt and compromise, it's starting to wear on me. The open marriage that was supposed to be freeing now feels like a game where the rules keep changing. And I'm the only one who has to follow them. At first, I thought I could handle it. That it was just a rough patch we'd get through. But as the weeks go by, I'm starting to question everything, my marriage, this arrangement, and whether I'm really okay with all the compromises I've been making. Because while Kevin claims to be fine with the open relationship, his actions are telling a different story. And I'm left wondering if I'm the one who's losing in the end. Meeting Evan was like stepping into a different world. It wasn't planned, of course. Nothing about this open marriage felt particularly planned. It was more like a series of unexpected turns. Each one bringing me closer to someone I didn't know I needed. I met Evan at a coffee shop I had started going to when I needed a break from everything. It was one of those neighborhood spots that felt far enough from home to give me space. But still close enough that I could rush back if needed. On the outside, it was just an ordinary cafe with worn wooden tables and a barista who always seemed a little too excited about latte art. But inside, for me, it became a kind of refuge. A place where I could breathe without worrying about Kevin or the kids. Or what new rules were cropping up in our ever-complicating arrangement. Evan was sitting by the window the first time I noticed him. He was older, mid-40s. I guessed, but had a kind of presence that drew me in. He wasn't loud or flashy. Just calm, like he was perfectly at ease with himself. He wore a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up casually, and his silver-streaked hair made him look distinguished without trying too hard. There was something about the way he looked out at the street, sipping his coffee slowly, that made me wonder what his story was. We didn't speak that first time, but every time I went back, I noticed him more. He always sat at the same table, always had the same quiet presence. And eventually, I found myself looking forward to seeing him there. It was as if he became a constant in my routine. A calm in the storm I didn't even know I was living in. It took about 2 weeks of shared glances before he finally approached me. It was a simple conversation. The kind you might have with a stranger when your eyes meet one too many times. He asked if I minded sharing a table. And I said yes before I even thought about it. I wasn't nervous or anxious. Just curious. There was no pretense. No hidden agenda. It was just two people talking in a coffee shop. That's how it started. Evan wasn't like anyone I dated before. He wasn't flashy or overly romantic. He didn't try to sweep me off my feet. But he had this way of making me feel seen, really seen. We talked about everything, from the books we were reading to the music we liked. Nothing deep at first, just light conversation. But it was enough to make me feel like I was more than just a wife and mother. I was a person with thoughts, ideas, and desires that were separate from my marriage. From Kevin, from the life I had settled into. After a few weeks of coffee shop conversations, Evan asked me out on a real date. It wasn't anything extravagant, just dinner at a quiet restaurant. But it felt like an escape. When I was with him, the tension of my marriage, the constant push and pull with Kevin, all of it melted away. For a few hours, I didn't have to think about whether I was breaking some unwritten rule or if Kevin would find a way to make me feel guilty later. I could just be. That first date with Evan was when I realized how different things could be. He was attentive but not in an overwhelming way. He asked about me, really asked, and listened to my answers. He wasn't distracted, checking his phone or rushing the conversation along. He was present, and that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just going through the motions of life. I felt alive. Of course, I had no intention of telling Kevin the details. We had agreed on, don't ask, don't tell, and I wanted to keep it that way. I knew it wasn't fair to rub my happiness in his face, especially given how much he seemed to be struggling with this arrangement. But even without me telling him, Kevin seemed to sense that something had changed. He could see it in the way I smiled more, in the way I seemed more relaxed, more content, and that's when his questions started. Kevin had never been the type to pry before, but now he wanted to know everything. Who was I seeing? What was he like? How serious was it? I tried to keep my answers vague, just enough to satisfy him without breaking the rules. But it didn't stop him from asking more. Every time I mentioned Evan, even in passing, Kevin would find a way to critique him. He's probably just doing it for the chase, Kevin would say. Guys like that don't stick around. It's all a game to them. At first, I brushed it off, thinking Kevin was just struggling to adjust. But as time went on, his comments became more frequent and more cutting. It was like he couldn't stand the idea that I might be enjoying myself, that I might have found something with Evan that went beyond just casual dating. And that's when I started to see the cracks in our open marriage. Kevin had always been the one pushing for this. He was the one who wanted the freedom to explore, to experience new things outside of our relationship. But now that I was the one finding joy in it, he couldn't handle it. It was as if he expected me to stay on the sidelines, to play along but not actually get anything out of it. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. I tried to keep things light, not to make a big deal out of it. I still followed our rules, no details, no sharing too much. But every time I mentioned something positive about Evan, Kevin would find a way to tear it down. He's just flattering you, Kevin would say dismissively. That's what older guys do. They know what women want to hear. It hurt, even if I didn't let it show. Kevin had always been supportive of me, always my partner in life. But now, it felt like he was turning into someone I didn't recognize. Someone who couldn't handle the idea of me being happy without him. I didn't stop seeing Evan, though. I couldn't. Being with him was the one thing that made me feel like I was still myself. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized how much I had been missing. It wasn't just about the romance or the excitement of something new. It was about being seen and appreciated in a way that I hadn't felt in years. But with every date, every moment I spent with Evan, the tension with Kevin grew. It was like a slow building storm, one that I couldn't avoid no matter how hard I tried. Kevin's critiques turned into passive-aggressive comments, and soon, it felt like everything I did was being scrutinized. The breaking point came when I asked Kevin to watch the kids for one of my dates with Evan. It wasn't the first time he had agreed to do it, but this time felt different. Kevin had been distant all week, and when I asked if he'd be home by 9, he said yes without hesitation. But just as I was getting ready to leave, he texted me, saying he'd be working late and wouldn't make it back in time. I was left scrambling, trying to find a sitter at the last minute. It wasn't the first time Kevin had pulled something like this. But this time, it felt deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing it on purpose, trying to sabotage my plans. I found a sitter, but the night was ruined. I couldn't relax, couldn't enjoy my time with Evan because I knew I had to rush back home. And when I got back, Kevin acted as if nothing had happened, as if it was just an innocent mistake. Another night of overtime. But I knew better. This was about control, about him trying to regain some power in a situation that was slipping away from him. And it was working. The more Kevin tried to control things, the more I started to question whether this open marriage was really working for me. At first, it felt like freedom, like a chance to explore and experience life in a new way. But now, it felt like a trap, a game where the rules kept changing. And I was the only one playing by them. Evan, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the turmoil at home. With him, everything was simple, easy. He didn't ask for too much, didn't make demands or question my choices. He was just there, steady and constant, like that calm presence I had first noticed in the coffee shop. But as much as I cherished my time with him, I couldn't ignore the growing storm at home. And the worst part? I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was okay. As my relationship with Evan deepened, the cracks in my marriage with Kevin became impossible to ignore. It started slowly, subtle at first, like the way he'd make small comments that lingered in the air a little too long, or how his eyes would follow me when I was getting ready for a date. I could sense his discomfort, but I told myself it was just part of the adjustment process. After all, this whole open marriage thing was new to both of us. It was bound to be a little rocky. But it wasn't just the small comments anymore. It was the way Kevin's behavior began to shift. Like he was no longer the same man who had so confidently proposed this arrangement. The first major sign was when he started asking me for details about my dates with Evan. At first, it was innocent enough, curiosity. I guessed he'd ask how my night went or if we did anything interesting. I didn't mind sharing little tidbits here and there, but I was careful not to go too deep. Our agreement was based on the "don't ask, don't tell" rule, and I wanted to respect that. But as the weeks went on, his questions became more pointed. He wasn't just asking about how my night was, he wanted specifics. What did you two talk about? Did you guys go anywhere new? Did you have a good time? Each question seemed harmless on the surface. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, a need to know more. A need to control the narrative. It felt intrusive. I gave him as little as I could. Vague responses that I hoped would satisfy him without crossing any boundaries. But nothing I said seemed to be enough. He'd press for more, and when I resisted, his mood would shift. He became distant, pulling away from me emotionally, as if I had done something wrong by not feeding his curiosity. It was confusing and hurtful. This was his idea. After all, he had pushed for this. And now that I was actually embracing it, he seemed to be unraveling. The critiques started soon after. Every time I mentioned something positive about Evan, Kevin would find a way to tear it down. If I told him about a nice dinner Evan and I had, Kevin would dismiss it as if it meant nothing. "It's just dinner," he'd say. "Guys do that all the time. It doesn't mean anything." If I told him how much fun I had, he'd roll his eyes and make a snide comment about how I was only seeing the good parts. "Of course you're having fun," he'd say. You don't have to deal with the day-to-day stuff with him. It hurt, more than I expected it to. I wasn't asking for his approval, but his constant dismissal of my happiness with Evan made me feel like I was doing something wrong. Like I wasn't allowed to enjoy this part of my life. The freedom I thought I was gaining through our open marriage was slowly being overshadowed by Kevin's resentment. Then there was the incident with the kids. I had planned a date with Evan on a Friday night, and I asked Kevin if he could watch the kids while I was out. He agreed, as he usually did, and I didn't think twice about it. But as the day went on, I started to get this nagging feeling, a kind of unease that I couldn't quite shake. I texted Kevin in the afternoon just to double-check that he'd be home on time. He reassured me with a simple, "Yeah, I'll be home by 9. I wanted to trust him, so I pushed the doubt aside. But as 9 o'clock approached, I still hadn't heard from him. I called him, and after a few rings, he picked up. "Hey, I'm still at work," he said casually, as if this wasn't a big deal. "I'll be late. I had to pick up some overtime." I froze. Overtime? He hadn't mentioned that earlier. And now, with only an hour before my date, I was left scrambling for a sitter. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. Agreed to help and then backed out at the last minute. But this time, it felt deliberate, like he was trying to sabotage my plans. To make it harder for me to enjoy myself with Evan, I managed to find a sitter. But the entire evening was tainted. I couldn't relax, couldn't fully enjoy my time with Evan because I was constantly checking the time, worrying about getting home on time for the kids. When I finally did get home, Kevin acted as if nothing had happened. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the stress he'd caused. It was like he expected me to just roll with it, like it was no big deal. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a knot of resentment build in my chest. This wasn't what I signed up for. We were supposed to be in this together, supposed to be supporting each other in this new chapter of our marriage. But instead, it felt like Kevin was trying to control me, trying to sabotage my happiness. The next day, I tried to bring it up. I casually mentioned how stressful it had been to find a sitter at the last minute, hoping he'd take the hint and acknowledge what he'd done. But instead, he brushed it off. "You figured it out, didn't you?" he said, not even looking up from his phone. It's not like it was the end of the world. I didn't push it. I didn't want to start a fight. But inside, I was fuming. It wasn't just about that one night. It was about the pattern that was emerging. The way he was slowly trying to take back control after being the one to push for this open relationship in the first place. It didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, Kevin became more critical of everything I did. He started making comments about my outfits before I left the house, telling me to be careful about how I dressed because of what the neighbors might think. He'd stand in the doorway, arms crossed, looking me up and down like he was assessing whether I looked appropriate enough to leave the house. It was infuriating. To avoid conflict, I started wearing jackets over my clothes, covering up before I left, just to keep him from making another comment. It felt ridiculous, like I was sneaking out of the house like a teenager. But I didn't know what else to do. Every time I tried to push back, he'd turn it into a bigger issue, acting like he was just being concerned for my reputation, for the kids' sake. Then there was the issue of Evan dropping me off at home after our dates. Kevin became obsessed with the idea that the neighbors would see a strange car pulling up late at night and start asking questions. He didn't want anyone knowing about our arrangement, and he certainly didn't want the neighbors gossiping. So, I had to shift my dates with Evan to the afternoons, opting for lunch instead of dinner. It wasn't a huge inconvenience, but it felt like another compromise, another way I was bending to keep the peace. And while I enjoyed the lunch dates with Evan, working from his place sometimes, spending quiet afternoons together, I missed the feeling of dressing up, of going out for a night on the town. Lunch dates were nice, but they didn't carry the same magic, the same excitement. But no matter how much I compromised, it never seemed to be enough for Kevin. He still found reasons to criticize. One night, after Evan had paid for an Uber to take me home, Kevin launched into a rant about how I shouldn't rely on another man to get me places, how it made him look weak. I couldn't believe it. He was the one who didn't want Evan dropping me off, and now he had a problem with Uber too? It was like no matter what I did, I couldn't win. The worst part was, I was starting to lose the excitement I once had. The thrill of the open marriage, the freedom to explore something new. It was all being overshadowed by Kevin's constant need to control everything. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a phase. But deep down, I knew something had changed between us. This wasn't just about Evan. This was about Kevin's inability to handle the reality of what he had asked for. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was okay. The tension in my marriage with Kevin was no longer something I could ignore. What had started as occasional comments or small disagreements about my relationship with Evan had turned into a constant undercurrent of discontent in our home. It was like I was always walking on eggshells, waiting for the next remark, the next critique, or the next subtle act of sabotage. It began with the outfits. Kevin had never cared much about what I wore before, but now, he had an opinion about everything. If I wore something a little more fitted or revealing for a date with Evan, Kevin would make a comment about how the neighbors might talk. He acted like he was worried about my reputation, but it felt like something more than that. He was trying to control me. At first, I thought it was just him being protective, maybe even jealous in a way he didn't want to admit. I tried to see it as a natural reaction to the situation, even though it irritated me. But the more he pushed, the more I realized that this wasn't about protecting me or worrying about what other people thought. It was about keeping me in check. The comments escalated quickly. He started making me feel self-conscious about my choices. Like I wasn't allowed to dress up or look nice for anyone but him. He never said it outright, but it was clear in the way he'd frown when I walked out of the bedroom. Already dressed for a date. He'd look me up and down, then casually suggest I throw on a jacket before I leave, just in case someone sees me. At first, I argued. I didn't see why it mattered what I wore, especially since we'd agreed that we could live our separate lives while maintaining the structure of our marriage. But the more I fought back, the more intense his reactions became. I wasn't in the mood for constant fights, especially when the kids were around. So I started wearing jackets to cover up before leaving. It wasn't about what I was actually wearing, it was about avoiding conflict. But even with the compromises I made, it never seemed to be enough. Kevin had moved beyond worrying about my clothes, now. He was obsessed with how my dates might be perceived by others. He started expressing concern over Evan dropping me off at home after our dates. Especially if it was late at night. He'd pace around the house, making comments about how the neighbors might see a strange car pulling up and start asking questions. What if they think something's going on? You know how people gossip. He'd say. It wasn't like our neighbors were standing at their windows, waiting for something scandalous to happen. But Kevin acted as though they were. He was becoming paranoid, like the whole neighborhood was watching and judging us. Even though no one ever said a word. He couldn't handle the idea of anyone knowing about our open marriage. Even though we had no reason to believe anyone cared. It was just another way for him to exert control over the situation. To ease his paranoia, I shifted my dates with Evan from the evenings to lunchtime. It wasn't ideal. I missed the excitement of dressing up and going out for dinner, but it felt like the easiest way to keep the peace. I started spending my lunch breaks with Evan instead, going to his place to relax and talk, or sometimes working from his home office. He didn't seem to mind the change, and in some ways, it was more convenient for both of us. But I couldn't help but feel like I was sacrificing something. The thrill of getting dressed up, the feeling of anticipation before a night out, it was all dulled by this constant need to compromise. I'd lost the sense of freedom that I thought the open marriage was supposed to give me. Instead of feeling liberated, I was starting to feel trapped by Kevin's insecurities. Kevin's control didn't stop with my clothes or the timing of my dates. Soon, he started questioning everything about my relationship with Evan. He'd ask more and more about what we did together. Even though he'd initially insisted we follow the "don't ask, don't tell" rule, it was as if he couldn't stand not knowing. But at the same time, he resented whatever I shared. If I mentioned that Evan had cooked me dinner, Kevin would make some snide comment about how it didn't mean anything. That anyone could throw together a meal. If I told him about a fun day we spent together, Kevin would downplay it, acting like it was trivial or not worth mentioning. It felt like no matter what I said, Kevin had to find a way to diminish it. Like he couldn't stand the idea of me enjoying something outside of our marriage. I tried to keep things light, to avoid bringing up Evan too much. But it didn't seem to matter. Kevin was always fishing for information, asking vague questions and then acting hurt or annoyed when I answered. He wanted to know everything but hated hearing any of it. It was a no-win situation. One of the most frustrating things about all of this was the way Kevin would turn things around on me, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong. If I pushed back against his constant need for control, he'd accuse me of being disrespectful to our marriage. It's just about respect, he'd say, as if I didn't understand the concept. But the more he insisted it was about respect, the more it felt like it was about control. He wasn't interested in maintaining mutual respect. He was interested in making sure I stayed within the boundaries he set. And the worst part was, he didn't seem to realize, or care, that those boundaries kept shifting. Every time I adjusted, every time I made a concession to keep the peace, he'd find something new to criticize, something else to restrict. It wasn't just about my relationship with Evan anymore. It was about Kevin needing to reassert control over our entire dynamic. The man who had once been so excited about the idea of an open marriage was now trying to rein me in, to put me back in a box that suited him. And I didn't know how to deal with that. The breaking point came when Evan sent me flowers. It was a sweet, thoughtful gesture, nothing extravagant. Just a simple bouquet to brighten my day. But when the flowers arrived at the house, Kevin lost it. He acted like it was a personal attack. As if Evan sending flowers was some kind of threat to our family's safety. He ranted about how dangerous it was for Evan to know our home address. How it put our kids at risk to have a strange man sending gifts to the house. I could understand his concern to some extent. Maybe it wasn't the smartest move for Evan to send flowers directly to the house. But the way Kevin reacted was completely over the top. He acted like Evan was a stranger. Someone dangerous. Rather than the man I had been seeing for months. His paranoia reached new heights that day. And no matter how much I tried to calm him down, he wouldn't let it go. To make matters worse, Kevin insisted that I not bring any gifts home from Evan again. He argued that it violated our "don't ask, don't tell" rule, even though it wasn't like I was flaunting anything. It was a bouquet of flowers. For God's sake. But to Kevin, it was more than that. It was proof that I was receiving attention, affection, and maybe even something more than what he was willing to give. The irony wasn't lost on me. Kevin used to joke about how I wouldn't find chivalry or romance in an open relationship. How I wouldn't get to experience the thrill of dating like I had in the past. And now that I was getting that very thing, now that I had someone who was treating me with care and attention, Kevin was furious. The most infuriating part of all of this was how Kevin dismissed his own role in our situation. When I asked him if he ever took the women he was seeing on dates, he scoffed. "No, it's just sex," he said, as if that made everything okay. "None of that lovey-dovey stuff you're doing." He acted like what I had with Evan was somehow wrong because it involved more than just physical intimacy. As if emotional connection was a violation of the rules. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the double standard. Kevin was fine with the open marriage when it suited him. When it was about casual encounters and physical gratification. But when I found someone who made me feel valued and appreciated, suddenly, I was the one in the wrong. Suddenly, I was breaking the unspoken rules. It all came to a head one night when I finally confronted Kevin about the constant shifting of boundaries. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told him how exhausting it was to keep up with his ever-changing rules. How it felt like he was trying to control every aspect of my life. I laid it all out, the outfits, the dates, the flowers, everything. But instead of acknowledging any of it, Kevin brushed it off. "It's just a respect thing," he said, like that was supposed to justify everything. He acted as though I was the one overreacting. As though my feelings didn't matter. He didn't see, or didn't care, how much his constant need for control was sucking the joy out of everything. I walked away from that conversation feeling more defeated than ever. I had hoped that confronting him would lead to some kind of resolution. That maybe we could get back to a place where our open marriage actually worked for both of us. But instead, it felt like I was talking to a wall. Kevin wasn't interested in compromise. He was interested in control. And as I stood in the kitchen later that night, staring out the window into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly losing myself in this arrangement. The open marriage that was supposed to bring us freedom had become a cage, one that Kevin held the keys to. Shifting from dinner dates to lunch dates wasn't as easy as I'd imagined. It felt like a subtle yet significant loss. I used to look forward to evenings with Evan, nights where I could slip into a dress, put on makeup, and feel like the version of myself that existed before I was a wife and mother. That version of me still felt alive, hidden beneath the layers of responsibility and compromise. Those dinner dates gave me permission to let her out, even if just for a few hours. But Kevin's constant policing of my life made it impossible to enjoy the things I once took for granted. The pressure about what the neighbors might think, the way he scrutinized my clothes, and his obsession with the optics of Evan's car pulling up late at night all led to the same outcome. I had to adapt. I had to change. Again. For him. And it frustrated me more than I could express. Switching to lunch dates seemed like a reasonable compromise at first. I'd still get to see Evan, but in a less conspicuous way. We could meet up during the day while the kids were at school, while Kevin was at work. No late-night car drop-offs. No dresses to be judged. No risk of a neighbor spotting me coming home after dark. It should have made things easier. But instead, it just felt like another layer of control had been placed on me. The compromise left me bitter. Instead of embracing the open marriage like we had agreed, I was bending to keep the peace. I tried to make the best of it. I'd meet Evan for lunch at his place, where I could bring my laptop and work remotely for a few hours. Evan didn't mind the change in schedule. He seemed happy just to spend time with me, no matter when or where. And while I enjoyed our lunches together, there was a part of me that missed the excitement of our evening dates. I missed dressing up, going out, and feeling like I was stepping out of my regular life for a little while. The lunches were casual, comfortable. I'd wear something easy, nothing that would catch Kevin's eye if I came home in it later. Evan and I would sit on his couch, talk about our weeks, and enjoy a simple meal together. It was pleasant, but it wasn't the same. I felt like I was sneaking around. Even though I wasn't doing anything wrong, I was still following the rules, still abiding by the boundaries Kevin and I had set. But it didn't feel like I was living freely. It felt like I was constantly trying to stay within the lines of Kevin's ever-shifting expectations. As the weeks went by, I began to resent the way things had changed. I resented how much Kevin had managed to influence my relationship with Evan without even being involved in it. He wasn't the one seeing Evan, but his presence loomed over everything I did. I felt like I couldn't fully enjoy my time with Evan because, in the back of my mind, I was always thinking about how Kevin would react. I was constantly navigating around his emotions, his criticisms, his jealousy. Then, one day, I caught myself looking at the clock while I was with Evan, calculating how much time I had left before I needed to head home. I'd stopped losing myself in the moments we shared, stopped enjoying the carefree connection we had once had. Now, I was managing everything, timing it all perfectly to ensure that I didn't upset Kevin, that I didn't cross any invisible lines. The emotional toll was heavier than I realized. My relationship with Evan had started as something liberating, something that allowed me to reconnect with parts of myself I hadn't felt in years. But now, it was becoming another source of stress. I didn't want to think about Kevin when I was with Evan, but I couldn't help it. I didn't want to feel guilty about enjoying myself, but guilt clung to me like a second skin. It was impossible to shake. What made it worse was that Kevin didn't seem to recognize any of this. He didn't see, or didn't care, how much his constant policing was affecting me. He thought he was being reasonable, even protective. He thought that by expressing his concerns about the neighbors, about Evan dropping me off, he was doing the right thing for our family. But in reality, he was strangling the joy out of the one part of this open marriage that had actually made me feel alive. It wasn't just about the dates anymore. It was about how Kevin's rules were slowly suffocating me. I wasn't allowed to fully enjoy my time with Evan because I was too busy tiptoeing around Kevin's insecurities. Every time I found a way to make things work, whether it was adjusting the time of my dates or covering up with a jacket, Kevin would find something else to critique. There was always something. And the worst part? I had started to internalize his criticisms. I found myself second-guessing everything I did, wondering if I was pushing too far, if I was doing something wrong. I began to feel guilty for even wanting to see Evan, for enjoying his company. I questioned whether I was being selfish, whether I was putting my own desires above Kevin's needs. The doubts crept in slowly, but they were relentless. Evan, of course, was blissfully unaware of most of this. I didn't want to burden him with the drama at home. I wanted our time together to be an escape, a place where I could forget about the complexities of my marriage and just be myself. But even Evan noticed that I was more distracted than usual, that I wasn't fully present when we were together. He didn't push me for answers, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I hated that this was happening. I hated that the freedom I had found in my relationship with Evan was slipping away because of Kevin's insecurities. I hated that I couldn't enjoy something as simple as a date without feeling like I was doing something wrong. One afternoon, after another quiet lunch with Evan, I sat in my car in his driveway, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I hadn't dressed up for this date. I hadn't even bothered to put on makeup. I felt drained, emotionally and mentally. I stared at the steering wheel, wondering how things had gotten so complicated. How something that was supposed to bring us closer as a couple was slowly driving us apart. I thought back to the early days of our open marriage, when the idea had seemed exciting, when I believed it could work. But now, as I sat there in my car, all I could feel was exhaustion. I wasn't enjoying the open relationship anymore. I was managing it, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep doing that. When I got home that afternoon, Kevin was waiting for me in the living room. He didn't say anything at first, just gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. I felt the familiar tension rise in my chest, waiting for him to make some comment about my day, about Evan, about whatever he had decided was the issue this time. But instead, he said something that caught me off guard. "You're not having as much fun anymore, are you?" I paused, surprised by the question. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say no, that I wasn't having fun anymore, that his constant need to control everything had taken all the joy out of this arrangement. But I didn't say that. Instead, I just shrugged. "It's different now." He nodded, as if he understood. "I just want to make sure things are still working for both of us," he said, his tone measured. "You know, making sure we're both comfortable with how things are going." The irony wasn't lost on me. Kevin was the one making things uncomfortable. But I didn't have the energy to argue. I just nodded and headed upstairs, my mind racing. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I realized that I couldn't keep doing this endless cycle of compromises, of bending to Kevin's will just to keep the peace. I missed the excitement, the freedom, the feeling of being alive. And no matter how much I tried to adapt, it seemed like that part of me was slipping further and further away. I had no idea what the solution was. All I knew was that this wasn't working anymore, not for me. And for the first time, I started to question whether the open marriage had ever truly been about freedom or if it had always been just another way for Kevin to control the narrative. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I realized something else. I didn't just miss the dinner dates with Evan. I missed the version of myself that I had been on those dates, the woman who felt confident, desirable, and free. And as I stared at my reflection in the mirror, I couldn't help but wonder how much more of her I was willing to lose. As things between Kevin and me continued to deteriorate, it became clear that no matter how many compromises I made, it was never enough. The constant shifting of rules, the endless policing of my life, and Kevin's paranoia had started to take over everything. The tension that had once been occasional now seemed to invade every aspect of our lives, making me feel trapped in a situation that was supposed to offer freedom. It all came to a head one evening when I was getting ready for another lunch date with Evan. I had gotten used to these midday meetings, adjusting to Kevin's concerns about the neighbors and the optics of late-night drop-offs. In truth, I missed the nighttime excitement. But I had told myself that this was the only way to keep things running smoothly. Still, I was finding it harder and harder to pretend that everything was fine. That day, I had barely stepped out of the bedroom when Kevin caught me at the door. He eyed my outfit, a simple blouse and jeans. Nothing that should have raised any concerns. But I could already see the look in his eyes, that familiar tension building in his posture. "Why don't you just drive yourself today?" Kevin said casually, though his tone betrayed his underlying discomfort. I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I just think it's weird. Evan always paying for Ubers or picking you up. It doesn't look right," Kevin said, folding his arms as if he were delivering a well-reasoned argument. "People might start wondering why you can't drive yourself." My stomach sank. Another rule, another limitation. Evan had been kind enough to offer Ubers or pick me up so that I wouldn't have to worry about parking or dealing with the car. And now, that too was becoming a problem. Every little convenience, every small detail of my life was now under Kevin's scrutiny, as if any step outside his comfort zone was a potential threat to his control over me. "It doesn't make any sense, Kevin," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You didn't want Evan dropping me off because you were worried about what the neighbors might think. Now you don't want him to pay for Ubers either?" He shrugged, unfazed. "I'm just saying, it's better if you drive yourself. It's a respect thing." That phrase again, a respect thing. It was Kevin's go-to line whenever he wanted to justify a new rule or boundary. as if making me adjust every aspect of my life was about respect rather than control. It was maddening, but I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I felt like I was constantly being boxed in, forced to make concessions to keep the peace. Fine, I said, grabbing my car keys from the counter. I'll drive myself. But as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the bitterness that had started to settle in my chest. The constant bending and adapting to Kevin's ever-changing rules had worn me down. It wasn't just about the Ubers or the clothes or the dates anymore. It was about the fact that Kevin's control had seeped into every part of my life. I wasn't living on my own terms anymore. I was living on his. As I drove to Evan's place, I couldn't help but think about how different things had been when this all started. Kevin had pitched the open marriage as something that would give us both freedom. A way to reignite excitement in our lives while still staying committed to each other. And for a while, I had believed it. I had believed that we could make it work. That this new chapter in our marriage would be an adventure. But somewhere along the way, it had all gone wrong. I arrived at Evan's house. But the excitement that used to come with seeing him was dulled by the weight of my thoughts. He greeted me with a smile. And for a moment, I allowed myself to sink into the comfort of his presence. Being with Evan was easy. There was no judgment, no rules, no constant tension about what was or wasn't acceptable. He just liked spending time with me. And I liked being with him. It was that simple. But as much as I tried to focus on the present, Kevin's words kept echoing in the back of my mind. I felt guilty for even being here. As if somehow, I was the one in the wrong for enjoying this part of my life. It didn't make any sense. But that's how Kevin had made me feel, like every decision I made outside of our marriage was somehow an affront to him. Evan and I had a quiet lunch. But I wasn't fully present. He could tell something was off. Though he didn't press me for details. That was one of the things I appreciated most about Evan. He didn't push or pry. He just let me be. But as the afternoon went on, I realized I was doing the very thing I had promised myself I wouldn't do. I was letting Kevin's control seep into my time with Evan. I couldn't fully enjoy my time here because I was too busy navigating the rules Kevin had imposed on me. When I got home that evening, Kevin didn't say anything about the date. He didn't ask how it went or what we did. Instead, he acted as if everything was perfectly fine. Like there hadn't been any tension between us earlier. It was as if he expected me to just fall back into our routine. To accept that these constant changes were normal. That this was just the way things were now. But I couldn't do it anymore. I was tired of feeling like I was living a double life. Where every step I took outside our marriage was met with criticism or control. The open marriage was supposed to be about freedom. But it had become a trap. And the more I tried to adjust to Kevin's rules, the more I felt like I was losing myself. As the days went on, the tension between us only grew. Kevin started finding more reasons to criticize my time with Evan. He'd make snide comments about how much time I was spending away from the house or question why I was seeing Evan so often. It was as if he couldn't stand the idea of me enjoying any part of my life that didn't revolve around him. And the more he pushed, the more I began to question whether this was ever really about an open marriage at all. It wasn't just about jealousy anymore. It was about control. Kevin was trying to manage every aspect of my life. And I was letting him. I was compromising myself at every turn. Giving up pieces of my happiness just to avoid another fight. And the worst part was, I didn't even realize how much I had given up until I looked around and saw that I wasn't living for myself anymore. One evening, after yet another argument about my latest date with Evan, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring out the window. The house was quiet, the kids were in bed, and Kevin was in his office, probably pretending to work. But all I could think about was how much had changed in the past few months. How much I had changed. I had started out excited, nervous but hopeful about the possibilities of this open marriage. But now, I felt drained, defeated. Kevin's constant need for control had turned something that was supposed to bring us closer into a source of endless conflict. I wasn't enjoying the open marriage anymore. I was just surviving it. And in that moment, as I sat there in the silence of our home, I realized something important. I didn't want to live like this anymore. I didn't want to keep bending and compromising and sacrificing my own happiness just to keep Kevin from spiraling. I was tired of living by his rules. Tired of feeling guilty for wanting something more out of life. I didn't know what the future would hold. But I knew one thing for certain. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living under Kevin's thumb, constantly worried about how he would react or what new rule he would impose on me next. I needed to take back control of my own life. To reclaim the parts of myself that I had lost in this messy, complicated situation. As I sat there, staring out into the night, I knew that the time had come to make a decision. I didn't know what that decision would look like yet, whether it meant confronting Kevin, ending the open marriage, or something else entirely, but I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting Kevin's insecurities dictate my every move. For the first time in what felt like months, I felt a flicker of resolve. I wasn't going to let this continue. I wasn't going to let Kevin keep controlling me. It was time to take back my life, no matter what that meant. And as I stood up from the couch and walked upstairs to face whatever came next, I knew that I was ready. Ready to stop bending. Ready to stop compromising. And ready to start living for myself again. The flowers were beautiful, bright, vibrant, and unexpected. Evan had sent them to my house as a gesture of appreciation. Just because. He had no idea what he was stepping into. How something so simple and kind would become the catalyst for everything falling apart. When the delivery arrived, I was surprised. I hadn't mentioned to Evan that flowers might be an issue. That Kevin had created a delicate balance of control that was so fragile even something as innocent as a bouquet could shatter it. I smiled at the delivery driver, took the vase of roses inside, and placed it on the kitchen table. They looked perfect there, a splash of color in an otherwise ordinary day. For a moment, I let myself enjoy them, appreciate the thoughtfulness behind them. But the moment Kevin walked through the door, I knew the flowers were going to be a problem. His eyes zeroed in on the bouquet immediately. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at the flowers, his face expressionless. But I knew him well enough by now to recognize the simmering anger behind that silence. The tension in the room grew thick, and I could feel the impending confrontation before it even started. "Who sent those?" he finally asked. His voice tight, controlled. I didn't want to lie. There was no point. "Evan," I replied, trying to sound casual, as if this wasn't a big deal. "He just wanted to do something nice." "It's nothing." Kevin's face twisted into something dark and unreadable. For a second, he didn't respond, just continued staring at the flowers like they were something poisonous. Then, slowly, he turned to face me, his expression hardening. "This is dangerous," he said coldly. "He knows where we live. Where our kids live." I sighed, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Kevin, it's not like that. He's not a threat. He sent flowers. That's all." But Kevin wasn't listening. He wasn't even considering the possibility that Evan's gesture was harmless. All he could see was the violation of his control. The fact that someone else had crossed a line he'd never explicitly drawn but had always been there. Someone outside our marriage had touched our home. And for Kevin, that was unforgivable. "It's not just the flowers," he said, his voice rising. "It's the fact that he knows our address. Do you understand what that means? We have kids here, and you're letting some strange guy send things to our house. What if he shows up unannounced? What if?" I cut him off, my patience finally wearing thin. "He's not some strange guy. Kevin, he's the person I've been seeing for months. You knew that. And he's not dangerous. He sent flowers. For God's sake, not a bomb." Kevin's face flushed red, and I could see the anger building. "You're not taking this seriously," he snapped. "Do you understand what could happen? We agreed to certain rules. And this breaks those rules. You're bringing him into our home without my permission." My heart pounded as I tried to keep my voice steady. "He's not in our home. He sent flowers. That's it. You're overreacting." But Kevin wasn't hearing me anymore. He was too far gone. Too deep into his need to control the situation. "This violates everything we agreed on," he said, his tone final, as if he had made a ruling that couldn't be contested. "No gifts. No crossing boundaries like this. It's dangerous, and I'm not going to allow it." I felt a surge of anger rise up in my chest. "You're not going to allow it?" I repeated, my voice sharp. Since when do you get to make all the rules? Kevin, you've been changing the boundaries every time I turn around, making me feel guilty for everything I do. And now you're upset about a vase of flowers? This is about respect. He shot back. You agreed to follow the rules. And you're not respecting the boundaries we set. This isn't just about flowers. It's about you bringing him into our lives. Into our space. You didn't think about how this would affect our family. His words hit me hard. Not because they were true, but because they were the exact opposite of what was really happening. I had spent months bending to his rules, compromising over and over again, trying to keep everything in balance. And every time, it seemed like Kevin found a new way to tighten his grip. To make sure that no matter what I did, I could never truly be free in the arrangement we had supposedly agreed on. I have respected the boundaries, I said, my voice shaking with frustration. I've followed every rule you've thrown at me, even when you've changed them without warning. I've done everything I can to keep this marriage intact. But you keep moving the goalposts. It's never enough for you. Kevin's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to yell. But instead, he crossed his arms, his voice cold and condescending. Maybe you just don't understand what respect looks like anymore. That was it, the breaking point. I couldn't hold back anymore. Don't talk to me about respect. Kevin, you're the one who wanted this open marriage in the first place. You pushed for it, and I went along with it because I wanted to make you happy. And now that I've found someone who makes me happy, you can't handle it. You're so obsessed with controlling everything that you're suffocating me. He didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't used to me pushing back like this. And it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. I'm done with this, I continued, my voice trembling with anger and exhaustion. I'm done letting you dictate every aspect of my life. I've compromised enough. I've bent over backwards to make this work. And all you've done is make it harder. I can't keep living like this. Kevin stared at me, his face unreadable for a long moment. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, trembling with the weight of everything that had just been said. I stood there for a while, staring at the flowers on the table. The house was quiet, the tension still hanging in the air, and I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I had said what I really felt. I had pushed back against the constant pressure, the endless rules, the suffocating control that Kevin had imposed on me. And even though the argument had been intense, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But that relief was short-lived. Later that evening, Kevin reappeared in the living room, his face still tight with anger. He didn't look at me as he sat down on the couch, flipping on the TV as if nothing had happened. I knew this was his way of avoiding the conversation, his way of pretending that everything could go back to normal without addressing the real issues between us. But I couldn't pretend anymore. The open marriage had been his idea, but it had turned into something far more toxic than either of us had expected. The constant tension, the changing rules, the way Kevin had used control to manage his insecurities, it had all reached a breaking point. And I wasn't sure how we could move forward from here. The flowers sat on the table like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. What should have been a simple, sweet gesture had turned into the symbol of how broken our relationship had become. It wasn't just about Evan or the open marriage. It was about the fact that Kevin and I were no longer on the same page. That we hadn't been for a long time. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what came next. I knew things couldn't go on like this, but I wasn't sure what the solution was. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to try to salvage what was left. But another part of me was exhausted, worn down by the constant conflict and control. I didn't know if I had the energy to keep fighting. Kevin slept in the guest room again that night, a physical reminder of the distance that had grown between us. And as I lay there in the dark, I realized that the open marriage hadn't just strained our relationship. It had revealed cracks that had been there all along. Cracks that we had ignored, thinking that this new arrangement could somehow fix what was already broken. But now, those cracks were too deep to ignore, and I wasn't sure if they could be repaired. In the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen again, looking at the flowers. They were still beautiful, still vibrant, But now they felt like a weight. A reminder of everything that had gone wrong. And as I stood there, staring at the petals, I realized something important. I wasn't just angry with Kevin. I was angry with myself. I had allowed this to happen. I had let Kevin control me. Let him set the rules and change them whenever he felt like it. I had compromised myself over and over again, thinking that if I just bent a little more, if I just followed his lead, everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay, and it never had been. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. I didn't have all the answers. And I knew that there were still difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt clear-headed. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. I knew that something had to change. Whether that meant ending the open marriage, redefining our relationship, or walking away entirely. And as I took one last look at the flowers, I made a decision. I was done letting Kevin control my life. I was going to take back my power, no matter what that looked like. Because I deserved to be happy. And I wasn't going to settle for anything less anymore. After the incident with the flowers, the atmosphere between Kevin and me felt like a thick fog, tense and heavy. Impossible to ignore. We went about our daily routines. But the unspoken conflict lingered in every room of the house. We hadn't talked about what had happened, but the silence between us spoke louder than any argument could have. Kevin was distant, brooding, and I was emotionally drained, unable to pretend that everything was fine anymore. It wasn't long before the inevitable confrontation came. One evening, about a week after the flowers had arrived, I found Kevin in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. He wasn't watching it, not really, just sitting there, lost in thought. The sight of him like that, disconnected from me and from our life together, pushed me to a point where I couldn't stay silent any longer. I walked into the room, my heart racing, and stood in front of him. "We need to talk." Kevin looked up at me, his face unreadable. For a moment, he didn't respond, just stared at me as if he was trying to figure out what I was about to say. Then, with a sigh, he muted the TV and leaned back on the couch. "What do you want to talk about?" His tone was flat, emotionless, as though he already knew where this was going. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew was going to be a difficult conversation. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Everything. We can't keep living like this. Kevin, something has to change." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. I pressed on. "The open marriage, the constant rules, the boundaries that keep shifting. You've made it impossible for me to breathe. To be myself," I said, my voice steady but filled with frustration. "Every time I think I'm doing what we agreed on, you move the goalposts. You keep making new rules, changing things, and I'm the one who's left scrambling to keep up." Kevin sat up a little straighter, his arms crossed defensively. "I'm just trying to make sure we stay safe, that our family doesn't get hurt," he said, his voice low and tight. "You're the one who's been breaking the rules, bringing this guy into our lives more than we agreed on." I shook my head, feeling the familiar frustration rising inside me. "That's not true, Kevin. I've followed every rule we set. I've done everything I can to respect your boundaries. But you keep changing them. First, it was the outfits. Then it was when I could see Evan. Then it was how he could drop me off. And now, flowers are a problem?" I could see the anger flicker in his eyes. But he didn't interrupt. I kept going, my voice growing firmer as I spoke. "You wanted this open marriage. You're the one who pushed for it. And I agreed because I thought it would make us both happy. But instead of bringing us closer, it's pushed us further apart. I don't even know who we are anymore. Kevin, I don't know who I am anymore." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the conflict in his expression. Part of him wanted to fight back, to argue, to defend his actions. But another part of him, maybe the part that still remembered why we had gotten married in the first place, was listening. I could see the weight of everything we had been through hanging on his shoulders. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "It's not about control. It's about respect. You're doing things that affect me, that affect our kids. I just want to make sure we don't lose everything we've built." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find the right words. When I opened them again, I spoke softly, but with conviction. Respect goes both ways. Kevin, I've respected every boundary, every new rule you've thrown at me, even when it hurt me. But you haven't respected me. You haven't respected my feelings, my need for space, for happiness. I've spent months bending over backward to make this work. But you've done nothing but make it harder. You're so afraid of losing control that you've forgotten what it feels like to be partners. To trust each other. Kevin's face softened slightly, but the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface. I didn't mean to make you feel like that, he said after a pause. When you started seeing Evan, something changed. You were happier with him than you were with me. It felt like I was losing you. And I didn't know how to handle it. His admission caught me off guard. For the first time, Kevin was being honest about the root of his behavior. It wasn't just about the rules or the boundaries, it was about fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of not being enough anymore. I sat down on the couch across from him, the space between us feeling both physical and emotional. Kevin, this open marriage was supposed to be something we did together. It wasn't supposed to make you feel like you were losing me. But that's what's happening now, because you're trying to control everything. And it's pushing me away. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't know what to do. Okay? I thought I could handle it. I thought I wanted this. But now that it's real, now that you're actually happy with someone else, I don't know how to deal with it. I feel like I'm losing control. And it scares the hell out of me. I could feel my own heart breaking a little as I listened to him. This was the man I had married. The man who had once been my partner in everything. But now, we were strangers to each other, struggling to navigate a life that neither of us had expected. I don't want to hurt you, Kevin, I said softly, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep bending to your rules, trying to fit into this box you've created. I need space to breathe. I need freedom to figure out who I am, outside of all of this. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in a long time, I saw vulnerability there. What does that mean? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Are you saying you want to leave? I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was that something had to change. The life we were living now wasn't sustainable. The constant rules, the control, the emotional strain, it was all too much. I don't know what I want yet, I admitted, but I know that I need time to figure it out. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. Because it's not. We're not okay, Kevin. He nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. I know, he said quietly. I know we're not. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. It wasn't anger that filled the room now, it was sadness. The sadness of two people who had once loved each other deeply but had lost their way. Finally, Kevin spoke again. If you need space, I'll give it to you. I don't want to lose you. But I don't want to make you feel trapped either. His words surprised me. I had expected resistance, more arguments, more attempts to control the situation. But this was something different. It was the first time in months that Kevin had acknowledged my need for freedom. For space to breathe. Thank you, I said softly, feeling a flicker of relief. We didn't make any big decisions that night. There were no ultimatums, no dramatic resolutions. But for the first time, we had laid everything out in the open. We had confronted the truth of our situation. And even though it was painful, it was also necessary. There was no going back to the way things were before, not after everything we had been through. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As I went to bed that night, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, sadness for what we had lost, but also a sense of possibility for what might come next. I didn't know what the future held for me, for Kevin, for our marriage, but I knew that I couldn't keep living under the weight of his control. I needed space to figure out who I was, to reclaim the parts of myself that I had lost along the way. And maybe, just maybe, Kevin needed to figure that out too. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. There was still a long road ahead. Still difficult conversations to be had and decisions to be made. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to take back control of my life. I didn't know where that would lead me, but I was ready to find out. Because this confrontation, this moment of honesty, was just the beginning of something new. Something real. And no matter where it took me, I was ready to face it head on. The confrontation with Kevin had given me a moment of clarity. But clarity didn't always mean resolution. The days following our talk were filled with a strange, unsettling calm. Kevin kept his word. He stopped enforcing his constant rules. Stopped questioning every detail of my life with Evan, but the silence between us was heavy. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from understanding, it was the kind that comes from exhaustion. From two people too tired to fight anymore. We were coexisting, not really living, and deep down, I knew that this was the beginning of the end, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. We were like two strangers sharing the same house, moving around each other in quiet, careful patterns, avoiding the real issues that still hung between us. I continued seeing Evan, but even that had lost some of its spark. It wasn't his fault. Evan was still kind, still thoughtful, still everything I had wanted in an escape from the tension at home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living two separate lives. And neither of them felt fully real anymore. The excitement that had once filled our dates was now overshadowed by the knowledge that something was deeply wrong in my marriage. Something that a few lunch dates or flowers couldn't fix. One afternoon, after another quiet lunch with Evan, I found myself sitting in my car in his driveway, staring at the steering wheel, lost in thought. I should have felt relief being away from Kevin, being in a space where I wasn't being judged or controlled. But instead, I felt hollow. I was starting to realize that no amount of time with Evan could fill the growing void inside me. Something had shifted in me, something bigger than just my relationship with Kevin. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. I drove home that day, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite pin down. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, calm, quiet, ordinary, but the moment I walked inside, I felt a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. Kevin was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving. But instead, I walked in, grabbed a glass of water, and stood there, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he didn't. He barely looked up, just muttered a quick, "Hey." As if that was all the conversation we needed. The silence stretched on, and I realized that this was what our marriage had become: small talk, avoidance, and a growing distance that neither of us knew how to bridge. I stood there for a while, sipping my water, feeling the weight of everything that had gone unsaid between us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "We can't keep doing this, Kevin," I said, my voice quiet but firm. This isn't working." He looked up at me, surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to bring it up. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," I said, gesturing between us. "We're not even trying anymore. We're just existing. And it's not enough. Not for me. And I don't think it's enough for you either." Kevin sighed, setting his phone down on the counter. He rubbed his hands over his face, clearly exhausted. "I don't know what you want me to say," he muttered. "I thought things were getting better." "Better?" I echoed, incredulous. "Kevin, we barely talk anymore. We're avoiding each other. This isn't a marriage. It's two people pretending that everything is fine when it's not." He didn't respond right away, just stared down at the countertop as if the answers might be hidden in the marble pattern. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "What do you want to do? Then? End it?" The question hung in the air between us. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream yes. To tell him that this was over. That we had both lost too much of ourselves in this mess. But another part of me was terrified of what that meant. Ending our marriage felt like giving up. Like admitting that everything we had built was gone for good. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face that. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But we can't keep living like this. We need to figure something out." Kevin nodded, but he still didn't look at me. "Maybe we should take a break," he said after a long pause. "Give each other some space. Maybe that'll help." A break. The idea sounded both terrifying and like a relief at the same time. Space was what I needed, what we both needed. Probably, but it also felt like the beginning of the end. Like taking that first step towards something neither of us could undo. Still, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep suffocating each other like this, pretending that things would magically get better if we just kept going through the motions. Maybe, I said quietly, maybe that's what we need. We didn't say much more after that. The conversation ended with a mutual understanding that something had to change, even if we didn't know exactly what that change would look like. The days that followed were strange. Kevin and I moved around each other even more carefully than before, avoiding conflict, but also avoiding any real connection. It felt like we were both waiting for something to happen, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the final straw. It was a Friday evening, and I had just come back from another lunch date with Evan. The house was quiet when I arrived, and I assumed Kevin was in his office, as he often was these days. But when I walked into the living room, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Kevin was sitting on the couch, his laptop open in front of him, and on the screen was an email, a long, detailed message to someone I didn't know. As I got closer, I realized that the email was about me, about our marriage, about the open relationship. At first, I thought maybe he was writing to a therapist or a close friend, someone he trusted. But then I saw the name at the top of the email, Rachel. The name didn't register at first, but as I read more of the email, it became painfully clear who she was. Rachel was someone Kevin had been seeing, someone from his side of the open marriage, someone he had never mentioned before, not once. And this email, it was full of things he had never told me, things he had kept hidden, things that made me realize just how deep the cracks in our marriage had gone. He was telling her about how difficult things had been, how he felt like he was losing control, how he didn't know how to handle my relationship with Evan. But more than that, he was telling her things about me, private things, personal things, that he had never shared with me. He was confiding in her in a way he hadn't done with me in years. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the screen, trying to process what I was reading. It wasn't just that he had been seeing someone else. That was part of the deal. After all, it was the fact that he had hidden this part of his life from me, kept it secret, while all along accusing me of breaking the rules, of not respecting our agreement. "Who's Rachel?" I asked, my voice sharp and cold. Kevin jumped, clearly startled by my presence. He quickly closed the laptop. But it was too late. I had seen enough. "Who is she, Kevin?" I demanded, my anger rising with every word. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. He looked guilty, caught in a lie that he didn't know how to explain. "She's someone I've been seeing," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "For how long?" I asked, my hands trembling with the weight of what I was learning. "A few months," he admitted, "since before we started having problems." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. All this time, Kevin had been acting like he was struggling with my relationship with Evan. Like he couldn't handle the fact that I was happy with someone else. But in reality, he had been seeing someone too, someone he had hidden from me. Someone he had confided in while keeping me in the dark. I couldn't believe the hypocrisy. All the rules, all the boundaries he had imposed on me, all the guilt he had made me feel, it was all a lie. He had been living his own life, following his own rules, while pretending that I was the one who was breaking the agreement. "How could you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "How could you lie to me like this?" Kevin looked down at his hands, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said, his voice full of regret. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to make things worse." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "You've already made things worse, Kevin. You've been making them worse for months. I can't believe you, after everything. After all the rules you made me follow. You've been lying to me this whole time." He tried to reach out to me, but I pulled away. I couldn't stand to be near him. Not after everything I had just learned. "I need some space," I said, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I need time to think." Kevin didn't argue. He just nodded, looking defeated, as if he knew that this was the moment where everything would finally fall apart. I walked out of the living room, my mind spinning, my heart aching. I couldn't believe that this was how it had ended, that after everything. After all the compromises and sacrifices. This was the final straw. Kevin had lied to me. Betrayed me in a way that I hadn't expected. And now there was no going back. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that our marriage was over. There was no salvaging this. The trust that had been broken couldn't be repaired. And the love that had once held us together was gone, buried under layers of lies and resentment. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. It was time to move on, to reclaim my life, to start over. The open marriage had been the beginning of the end, but it had also been the start of something new, something I needed to find on my own. And as I drove away, the weight of everything that had happened slowly lifted. For the first time in a long time, I felt free, free from the rules, free from the lies, free to figure out who I was and what I wanted. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew that it was the only way forward. Because in the end, I had learned one thing. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for someone else's version of happiness. It was time to start living for me. I didn't know where I was going that morning. I just drove, letting the road stretch out in front of me like the unknown future I had no choice but to face. The city slipped away behind me, replaced by quiet roads and open fields. And for the first time in what felt like months, I wasn't weighed down by Kevin's control, his rules, or his accusations. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I knew that leaving was the right decision. I hadn't packed much, a bag of clothes, my laptop, and a few personal things. I left everything else behind, including the weight of the marriage that had been crumbling for so long. It wasn't an easy decision to leave, but it felt necessary. Kevin and I had reached a point where we couldn't continue like this. The open marriage had exposed the deep cracks in our relationship. Cracks that couldn't be filled with new rules or more compromises. They were too wide, too deep. I drove for a few hours, the silence in the car comforting. I had always been someone who needed time alone to process things. And now, I finally had that time. I wasn't sure how long I would be gone or what would happen when I returned. But I knew that I needed this space to figure things out for myself. Kevin had offered to give me space during our last conversation. But this was different. I wasn't asking for space anymore, I was taking it. Eventually, I found myself pulling into a small town I didn't recognize. It was quiet, with old brick buildings lining the main street and a few cars parked outside local shops. There was something peaceful about the place. Something that felt far removed from the chaos I had left behind. I found a small motel at the edge of town, checked in, and unloaded my bag from the car. As I sat on the edge of the motel bed, the reality of my situation started to settle in. I had left my home, my marriage, and everything familiar behind. For the first time in years, I was truly alone, with no one telling me what to do or how to feel. It was both terrifying and liberating. The first few days were difficult. I found myself constantly reaching for my phone, wanting to text Kevin, to see if he had tried to contact me. But I resisted. I knew that if I gave in, I would be pulled back into the same cycle of arguments and hurt. I needed to stay strong, to give myself the time and space I deserved. I spent my days wandering the small town, getting lost in quiet streets and coffee shops, trying to clear my mind. I thought about the last few months, the open marriage, Evan, the constant fights with Kevin. It had all started with the hope that we could find freedom, that we could explore something new while staying committed to each other. But instead, it had led to resentment, jealousy, and ultimately, betrayal. Kevin's affair with Rachel had been the final straw, but I knew that our marriage had been broken long before that. The open relationship had only exposed the fractures that had been there all along. We had lost trust in each other, lost the ability to communicate honestly, and lost sight of what had once made us strong. I thought about Evan, too. What we had shared had been real, and I had cared for him deeply. But even that had started to feel like another layer of complication in my life. I had been using my time with Evan as a way to escape the pain of my marriage. But in doing so, I hadn't given myself a chance to really confront the problems at home. Now that I was alone, away from both Kevin and Evan, I realized that I needed to stop running and start facing the truth. And the truth was, I had been avoiding myself for a long time. I had spent so much time trying to make Kevin happy, trying to follow the rules of our open marriage, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had gotten so wrapped up in pleasing everyone else, Kevin, Evan, even the idea of what a modern marriage should look like, that I had forgotten to ask myself what I really wanted. Sitting in that small motel room, I realized that I didn't want to live my life by someone else's rules anymore. I didn't want to bend and compromise myself for the sake of a relationship that wasn't working. I deserved more than that. I deserved to be happy, to be free, and to live a life that was true to who I was. It took me a week to fully process everything. I spent my days reflecting, journaling, walking around the quiet town, and slowly, the knots of tension in my chest began to loosen. I wasn't healed yet, I wasn't even close, but I was starting to feel like I had a direction. A sense of what I needed to do next. On the 7th day, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I knew what had to be done. I packed my bag, checked out of the motel, and started the drive back home. The road stretched out before me. The same road I had driven a week ago when I was running away from everything. But this time, I wasn't running. I was returning, not to fix things. Not to go back to the way things were. But to face the reality of my situation and make the decisions I needed to make. When I arrived back at the house, it felt strangely unfamiliar, like a place I had once known but had grown distant from. Kevin's car was in the driveway, but the house was quiet. I walked inside, and he was there, sitting on the couch, just like he had been the day I left. He looked up when I walked in, surprise flickering across his face. "You're back," he said, standing up slowly. I nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. "Yeah, I'm back." There was an awkward silence between us, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging in the air. But this time, I wasn't going to avoid it. I wasn't going to walk on eggshells anymore. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. Kevin nodded, sitting back down. I figured we would. I sat across from him, taking a deep breath before I spoke. "I've had a lot of time to think while I was gone. About us. About everything that's happened, and I realized that I can't keep living like this. I can't keep bending myself to fit into this idea of a marriage that isn't working. We've lost trust in each other. We've lost ourselves, and I don't think we can get that back." Kevin's face fell, but he didn't argue. He just looked down at his hands, nodding slightly as if he had been expecting this. "I don't know what the next steps are," I continued, "but I think we both know that staying together like this isn't healthy. We're just hurting each other more every day." There was a long silence before Kevin finally spoke. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about it too. I didn't want to admit it. But you're right. This isn't working anymore." His words hit me harder than I expected. Part of me had been bracing for a fight, for more denial or accusations. But hearing him acknowledge the truth, hearing him say that he knew it was over, felt both heartbreaking and relieving. "I don't hate you, Kevin," I said softly. "I don't blame you for everything. We both made mistakes. But I think it's time for us to let go." Kevin nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't hate you either. I didn't know how to handle everything. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I just made it worse." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. There was no more anger, no more fighting, just the quiet understanding that our time together was over. "I'll start looking for a place," Kevin said eventually, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out. I just want to make sure the kids are okay through all of this." I nodded, grateful that he was thinking of them too. "We'll do what's best for them. And for us." Over the next few days, we started the difficult process of entangling our lives. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the sadness of what we were losing hit me like a wave. But I knew, deep down, that this was the right decision. Staying together for the sake of a marriage that had already fallen apart would only hurt us more in the long run. As the days passed, I began to feel lighter, more at peace with the choice we had made. Kevin and I were no longer the couple we had once been. But that didn't mean we couldn't find happiness apart. I started to think about what my future might look like. What kind of life I wanted to build for myself now that I wasn't bound by the constraints of a relationship that no longer fit. I didn't know all the answers yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free to live for myself. Free to explore who I was, what I wanted, and what made me happy. And that, more than anything else, gave me hope. The open marriage had been the beginning of a long, painful journey, but in the end, it had also been the catalyst for change. It had forced me to confront the truths I had been avoiding for years. It had pushed me to rediscover myself, to demand more from my life, and to stop settling for less. And as I stood in the quiet of my home, I realized that I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. I wasn't afraid of being alone, or of starting over. I had found my strength again. And I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Because for the first time in a long time, I was truly living for myself. And that was enough.